Hello and welcome. You're listening to Sparking Spiritual Growth. I'm Jason Sparks, and for all of you here on Kingdom Purpose Radio, thanks for tuning in. Welcome back. I'm really excited about being able to start a new series of lessons going through the book of Exodus. If you've never studied this book, you're going to love it. And there are so many great lessons for us to learn. It gets into political ideas. It gets into the heart, the nature of what it means to be free, to be able to look at what God has designed for us and figure out for ourselves what it means to follow God from the heart and the freedom that comes from that. So looking at the book of Exodus, I want to share with you the theme, and this comes from Dave Miller. And he taught me in school, the school of preaching that I went through. He has a book, kind of a workbook, and he gives an outline and a theme or summary of each book of the Old Testament. And in this, he talked about the fact that the theme of the book of Exodus is that true deliverance and freedom come only from God. And that obviously is what's going on. The book of Exodus means to exit, right? This is about the exiting. And the people who are exiting here are people of Israel who are leaving the captivity and bondage of Egypt. This is the beginning of this 40-year wilderness wandering that the Jewish people experienced. And this would have been about 4,000 years ago. So Moses here is the main character in the book, and he is the one who really creates the systems in which a nation is born. And it comes out of some extreme situations. This is actually what we're going to be dealing with today, the first two chapters of the book of Exodus. But there's so much in here about this. The theme of the book, if you want to put it into one word, it's freedom. And freedom is, of course, something that we all treasure. It's a very important value for us, especially in America. We love to talk about our freedoms that we have and the rights that we have. And so we're going to talk about that all throughout the book and what it means, and really to get down to the heart of what does it actually mean to be a free people. And of course, we're also going to be talking about personal responsibility. You can't really have freedom unless you have personal responsibility. That's the core of freedom. If we become a people who have given up personal responsibility, then our democracy is doomed. And this is a core idea that's taught in this book of Exodus. And so we can look at this. We can look at the history of what's going on here. We can learn a lot of good things about our government. We can learn a lot of good things about life in general and about ourselves. So that's one of the reasons I'm really excited about getting into this book. And I hope you'll join me as we go through this. This first episode is going to be covering the first two chapters. And there are three parts that we could break this down into. The first one is we have the growth of fear and political control that's going on in Egypt. And then we have plans that the Egyptians enacted and how those plans backfired and forced even more oppression to the people of Israel from the Egyptian people. And then we have in Exodus chapter 2, we have the third part of this where Moses is born in the midst of all this turmoil and all the problems that are going on. It's the perfect timing for this. And we'll talk a little bit about how he grew up and what was going on at that time. So that's the basic rundown of an introduction to Moses and a background for the important work that he did. So let's talk about the first part. That's the growth of fear and political control. And that's found in Exodus chapter 1. And it goes all the way from chapter 1, verse 1 through verse 12. And it gives a very brief overview of what's going on. And from it, we can kind of extrapolate. We can kind of see some of the things that are happening and maybe even make some correlations to what we might see here, whether it be in our country or in the other countries that we might know about. We can see that a lot of these things, tactics are being used. Nothing much has changed. We only have so many things that we can do as options, and so we tend to do the same things. And even throughout history, we see these things happening time and time again. So at the end of Genesis, Joseph had risen to be second in command of all of the land of Egypt. And if you want to learn more about that, start reading from Genesis chapter 39 all the way through the end of the book, and you'll have a better understanding of what happened and how important it was that Joseph had risen to power. And Joseph, of course, being a child of Israel, and one of the sons, literally, of Israel, and one of the 12 sons. Those 12 sons would later become the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is where we get the term Israelites from, because this is the Israel nation. But before they were a nation, they were just simply a people. These are just 12 sons of a man named Israel. And Joseph then became prominent in the land of Egypt, and this happened because God was raising him up so that he could save his family from a severe famine in the land around Canaan, where Abraham was promised land by God. And that can be found in Genesis chapter 12, the first 3 verses there. So God had promised this land to Abraham, and of course, he did not receive the promise at the time, and his children hadn't received the promise, and even down through Joseph, they haven't received the promise, but they will receive this promise. And God never forgot that promise that he made to them, that he would give them the land. That was part of the promises that he made. And so he will work out a way to bring his people to that promised land, and at the same time, he's going to reveal himself to be the God of the universe in this book. And it's a fascinating idea. It looks like God planned for this to happen so that he could show himself to the world and show himself to as proof, as evidence that he is the God, that there are no others beside him, and we should only follow him. And God expected everyone to understand that. It had always been that way, ever since the beginning of time. Some people believe that polytheism was the name of the game, and then monotheism came from that. But it actually was reversed. It started out with monotheism, that people believed only in one God, and from there were many divisions and ideas that started being accepted, and all of a sudden people started looking, through corruption, people started looking around it and creating other gods in their own image. And this is what we can see in the book of Romans, chapter 1, for example. There's an explanation of that if you want to look into it. And God here is establishing himself and showing himself to be the only God. And that's an amazing accomplishment that he did. And he did it at I guess you could say, the expense of the land of Egypt, the people of Egypt. Now, it didn't have to be this way, but God showed himself to be this way. And he worked through the political situation of the time. And Egypt at this time was the major power in the world. And there was no people greater than the Egyptians. And it's during this time of the great empire of Egypt that God worked his way and found a way to bring out his own people, crippling the Egyptians when he did this. So that's what this book is about. And Joseph then, he passed away, he died, and there was a Pharaoh, a ruler that came after his death, who didn't remember him. And this is going to be then a problem, because if he had remembered him, if he had respected the memory of Joseph, then he wouldn't be treating the people this way, the people of Israel, in the way he's about to do this. Chapters 1 and 2 then give us this background. So what happens is the Pharaoh begins to see the people of Israel as a threat. Now, the Israelites had moved there. There was, according to the first few verses of this chapter 1, they had moved there with about 75 people. That's all there were, and it was just a family. And of course, it was a large family. You have 12 kids. You're going to have, and they're married and having children. It's going to be a large family. But when they moved in, Joseph invited them in because of his position and power, and the Pharaoh at the time welcomed them in. They were friends. They were allies. And they gave them the land that is called Goshen. And Goshen was a land that was good for grazing animals. Now, the Egyptians really looked down on shepherds. They thought that was kind of a dishonorable job. And all of the children of Israel were all shepherds. So there was already a little bit of problem, a little bit of tension. So they simply gave them a land that really wasn't being used, because they didn't have shepherding was not a thing. They really kind of despised it. But they certainly were glad to receive some of the benefits of the shepherding. So, of course, they can get milk, and they can get wool and all kinds of things from the shepherding. But they just didn't want to be a part of it. So they're kind of separated out already from when they first came in, which actually was a way of protecting the family and ensuring that the family would continue to grow and multiply, so that until the time came that they could go back and enter into the land that God promised them. And this is what's going on in the chapter. But when this new Pharaoh came around, the Pharaoh started realizing these people are growing tremendously in number, and they became a threat to the people of Israel. So listen what the scriptures say about this new situation. This is found in Exodus chapter 1, verses 6 through 11. It says, Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. So at this point, this is a generation or two after Joseph, the people of Israel had evidently, in a large part, stopped shepherding, and they started working with their hands, building buildings, making brick. They made the brick by hand, of course, and then they would build the buildings from that. And this was occupational things that they were doing, and that was not something that was oppressive. But what happened was the Pharaoh saw the people of Israel and saw the numbers, and he started becoming afraid of the people and thought, I better do something. I'm going to have to make sure that these people are not going to overrun us, right? And so this is why he then became, they were seen as a threat, and he started putting taskmasters over them to make things difficult for them, hoping that he would work them so hard that they would stop actually having children as a result of this, or at least slow it down, kind of curb that, so that they won't overrun the entire population of Egypt. Even though at this time they were still living in the land of Goshen, they were filling that up pretty well, but he could see it's going to spill over, and they're going to have control of the land. They're become a big threat. So distrust and fear entered the scene, and then the politicians sought ways to control the growth of population. So, like I said, they wouldn't be overrun with Israelites. As the new Pharaoh put it, Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. So he was afraid they would lose that source of work, right? That the source of people who were actually being able to work for them, and also that the Israelites would turn on them if they were ever attacked from the outside. Now, there's no reason for him to think that either of those are going to happen, except, well, he has a good reason to think that the people would end up leaving, and they would end up leaving, but he has no reason to think that they would turn against them if the enemies came from outside. But that's one of those things that brought up as fear, to bring out fear. So the authorities, they placed taskmasters over the people of Israel to force them to work even harder. Now notice it says that they did this to inflict them with burdens. Now that implies that they had already been given tasks to do, and the Pharaoh simply decided to make their tasks more demanding so that they wouldn't have the time or the energy to continue to reproduce. The oppression was not simply oppression for the sake of oppression. It had a goal. The goal was population control. And of course, the way that's going to happen is through physical labor. If you work them hard and long hours and make it difficult, they won't have as much time to have children, to raise children. They'll be more mature in the sense of they realize they don't have the time to raise them, so they're not going to try to have children. That's the hope that he has. This is a familiar scene. Politically minded people have often found excuses to oppress parts of society. I mean, fear has always been a very useful instrument. It may be a surprise to learn that at least some governments, they actually do seek to control population growth through this and other means. And we can point to different countries right now where they're openly advocating that you have a limit on how much growth you have. And some governments are very open about the idea that we need to curb how many children we're having, this kind of thing. So it hasn't changed, really. The methods or the fears may have changed, but they still have the same methodology in a lot of cases. But we see that governments can do many things in an attempt to control various parts or various tendencies of a population. Some of the things they may do, they may be good, and other things they do, they may be unfair and cruel. But notice how Pharaoh used fear to garner support for the oppression of Israel. That certainly goes on today. He said, listen to what he said here when he said, "The people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them," right? So he talks up the fear that probably other people have already expressed, but he's at least building the idea in their minds. He's given the idea that these people really can't be trusted. And so he's using that fear to control the people. And that still goes on today. I mean, pretty obviously. The media is divided, and it seeks to divide the country for financial gain because they know that people love to have an enemy, right? They want to have people that they can blame for all their problems and all their troubles. And not only that, when they divide the people up, those people can have other people to blame for their own problems. It also then seems like a public service when you're reporting about these other people who have now been made your enemy because of fear. And not only that, they know that you'll be watching their channel. If they're speaking to your fear, you'll be watching their channel because they're the only ones reporting on it. And when they report on it, of course, you get to see advertisements, and they get to be paid by these advertisers in order to make money. That's how they make their profit. And so they convince people to watch them, and usually, a lot of the times, it's based on fear. That's for personal gain right there. That's so that the people that own the companies can make money. And it also serves to allow the people that are watching to vilify another group of people. And once that group of people is identified, it's so much easier to build a case against them. So we have Republicans and Democrats vilifying each other, and they're not always easy to tell the difference, but we can tell the differences pretty quickly if we're talking to someone. We divide up in this country by skin color, by language, by economic status, even by accents. I mean, think about this. Someone who is considered to have a Southern accent is often looked down upon and seen as ignorant, that kind of thing. And all the different accents that we have in this country, we kind of have stories related to those. We see them in a certain way simply by the way that they sound and when they're speaking English. We even do this with people that are coming over from other countries, right? So we have an accent and we assume certain things because of that. And the reason for the assumptions sometimes is because we've been taught. And it may not have been an intentional teaching, but it was a teaching nonetheless. And we've seen lots of division. Think about the divisions that we've seen over COVID-19 and the response of the government. It doesn't matter what you think about it. There is always another side, and that other side tends to be vilified so that we can have someone else to blame for our fears and our problems. And so this has been something that has made a tremendous amount of wealth for media, just covering, for example, COVID-19. And there are a multitude of reasons that politicians and media moguls can sow fear, and a lot of reasons that they can use it to make changes to our culture. But why is it that we can't seem to understand that we're all being played to some degree? It's no different now than it was almost 4,000 years ago in Egypt with a new Pharaoh. In that time, God was going to use the division for his own glory and to provide what he promised to his people. And we can see here a principle that has always been, and that's expressed in Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, where Paul wrote, "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose." What God was preparing to do in Egypt would actually cripple the greatest, most powerful political machine in the world at the time, and it would conclusively show God to be the only God in the universe. Now that's what he is intending to do with this. That's the response that he has, and he is actually going to use the pride and the fears and the prejudices of the people of Egypt against them. But he's always acted that way. He's always shown himself to be superior in so many different ways. And of course, whatever we're seeing going on in this world, in this country, and even in our own state and local governments, if we see those kind of things going on, we need to understand that there is a God in the universe, and he knows what's happening, and he is able to actually use those things for his own glory. We want to be on the side of God when everything starts to go down, right? We want to make sure that we behave in such a way that he's not working against us, but that we can actually benefit whenever he acts and whenever he moves. So that's the idea that we're seeing in this first part of this, the plans and the motives, the growth of fear, and how that they've used this fear to enact political control. And we can see pretty easily that we might fall into that category ourselves as a people from time to time. And, I'm not into big conspiracy theories and things like this, but I do know that there are people, and there are politicians, and there are media people, and there are all kinds of other kinds of people, even religious figures, who love to use fear as a means of personal gain. And it's easy to do it. It's easy to stoke up fear. It's easy to cause people, to arouse fear in other people. And when you arouse the fear in people, especially if a large mass of people have that fear, it's very easy to control, simply providing a little bit of a thought of what we can do to eradicate the problem. And this is exactly what's going to happen in this next part of the plan of the Egyptians. Have you seen anything in your life that illustrates a motive of fear? I want to challenge you to be careful and don't buy into fear-mongering. Don't allow these people to manipulate you through the idea of fear. Trust in God, turn to him, and allow things to happen for good. Just do it his way. Anything you'd like to discuss with me, please email me, jason@sparksmore.com. I appreciate you being a part of this. Now, the Egyptians then had a plan, and it started to backfire almost immediately, because here it is where Pharaoh said in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 9, "The people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they, the Egyptians, were in dread of the children of Israel." So this is how far the Egyptian authorities went in fear-mongering. The people of Egypt were in terror. They were terrified of the children of Israel. They were in dread of the children of Israel, it says. They just knew at any time these people were going to turn against them. Even though there's no evidence that they'd ever done anything as a people in opposition to the Egyptian government. There's nothing that they had done. They were simply living their lives the best that they could, doing what everyone was doing. They're going to work every day. They're trying to take care of their families every day. But simply because of Pharaoh, and maybe other people as well, it could have been a growing concern because of the number of people. That seems to be kind of natural, a natural tendency that we have. But because of this, the Egyptian leaders and the Pharaoh stoked that fear until the point came that the people were just terrified. But their plans backfired, and the more they oppressed the people of Israel, trying to get them to stop having children, really is what's going on, then the more children they had, the more they grew, the more powerful they became. This is the start of God coming to the rescue of his people. And it doesn't look like it, I'm sure, at the time when they were sitting through this and they saw the oppression becoming greater and greater, they probably didn't realize that this is the beginning of how God's going to rescue his own people. When we attempt to do something and fail, but we believe that we have the power and the right to do it, this is where the Egyptians were. They failed at first, but they knew that they could oppress these people, or they believed they could, and they believed they had the right to. So when we face that kind of situation, we either change tactics or we increase the intensity of what we're already doing. So the Egyptian rulers decided then to push even harder. And this is going to allow the people of God then to eventually leave because the Egyptians kept pushing harder and harder. And there's going to come to a point, they're going to come to a point, to a breaking point. You can only push so much before there's resistance. And they're going to find that happens in ways they never dreamed would happen at this resistance. The resistance actually doesn't come from the people. The resistance comes from God himself, because these are people who are protected by him and cared for by him and loved, and they will be brought to the land that was promised to them. Chapter 1 in verse 12 says, the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were in dread of the children of Israel. And verse 13 says, so the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. It was bad enough to have taskmasters set over them to make life more difficult. And I don't know if they, had taskmasters before, and these were simply new additions, or maybe Pharaoh called them up and said, listen, you need to make it more difficult. But whatever it is, there seems to be, it's implied that there's something changed here. These taskmasters then were told to turn up the pressure, to make them serve with harshness. And the idea here is that the taskmasters made demands that were very strict and precise. If you're working on building projects, which is what they were doing, then you assume a certain level of error. That's just part of the work. And there's a correlation, it's a reverse correlation, I guess, between the amount of error that you allow and the amount of time that a project's going to take. So the less error that you allow in a project, the more time the project's going to take, and vice versa. The more error that you allow, that means you're going to finish the projects faster. And we see this in house building, right? You can build a house pretty quickly, but in order to do that, you're going to have to allow certain levels of error, certain amount of error in there in order to, you're kind of cutting corners a little bit. And so a good contractor, a good builder will have to kind of make a judgment. How much error will I allow? Because there will always be errors. I mean, you're building a house, there's so much room for error, and there always will be a little bit. But the project manager has to determine, do I want to allow error enough that we can do this quickly, or am I going to be more demanding and make sure that we do it right so that it takes longer a period of time? Well, obviously, home builders want to get those things out as fast as possible, so they have to find a way to make it fast and at the same time have less error. Now, this is what the Egyptians were doing. They were requiring more and more service from the people of God, the children of Israel. And they were setting then extremely high standards for the work that they were doing. Verse 14 of chapter 1 says, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage and mortar and brick and all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. So there were extremely high demands of everything that's going on, everything that they're doing. They had huge demands on them. And it says that the Egyptians made their lives bitter with hard bondage. Now, you can imagine the strictness would include beatings and mistreatments, especially the way they're starting to see these people as these are people that we should be afraid of, and so they're going to beat them as if they had opportunities. The mistreatments then will come because this will help make sure and enforce the strictness, because, if you get beat for not doing your job right, you're going to do your job better the next time, so you can avoid the beatings. Now, this affected their mortar, their bricks, and in all manner of service in the fields. The children of Israel went from being guests in the land to becoming enslaved by a government that was afraid of them. Evidently, that was not far enough, though, because the Pharaoh informed the midwives of Israel that he expected them to kill all the males that they helped deliver in childbirth. This is how far it went. Now, this is a secretive thing. He called them privately and said, I want you, when you go and perform the duties of midwife, if you see that that the child is born as a male, kill him. Now, that would certainly curb the growth, right? The population growth. But not only that, it would curb the growth of the people, but the lack of males that were growing up would force the Israelite women to be married to Egyptian men. And the result would be a decrease in children who were loyal to Israel because their Egyptian fathers wouldn't allow that to happen. That's diabolical on so many levels. And of course, the greatest level of being diabolical is the fact that this was infanticide. And this is the extent that they went. This is how afraid of the people of Israel that they were. Thankfully, the midwives feared God. They knew what they were told to do was wrong, so they refused to do it. And in order to save themselves, they simply told Pharaoh's officials and Pharaoh himself that they just kept missing the births. In fact, it says the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. That was what they told Pharaoh. And in spite of the treatment, the slavery, and even the plot against the male children being born, it says that God blessed the people of Israel, and they multiplied and grew in power. So they grew even more. So when it didn't work, they increased. They increased the pressure. They created new ways of adding pressure, and they increased the demands, and they even started killing their babies. And in spite of that, God still continued to help them grow. Because this is God working. But Pharaoh didn't want to just dismiss the problem, so he went, of course, to from private commands, he went and made it law for all the people. In chapter 1 and verse 22, it says, so Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. Now this was a command given to all the people of Egypt. It was not a command for the Egyptians to kill their children. It was a command that the children that were born to the Israelites would be killed. Now that applied to everyone, so the Egyptians had the right then to go, and if they saw a baby boy being born or just born, they had the right to kill it. But it also was a command to the Israelites that they should kill their own children. This is what he says, and this is law. So he made this decree that everyone should kill their own children if they were born to them sons. And of course, by everyone, he meant all of the Israelite people. But every daughter would be left alive. Can you imagine the fear that's going on at this time? Can you imagine just sitting in your house thinking and wondering, especially if you had a child, if you just had a baby? Everyone knows you're pregnant, right? If you're a woman and you're pregnant, you're 9 months pregnant, you're going to work because you're being oppressed and you're being forced into labor and you're doing everything you can. You're going to give birth out in the field. That's what they would do oftentimes. And people are going to know. They're going to be able to see from one day to the next that, hey, it looks like you had a baby. And then there's going to be people asking questions. If they see a little boy growing up, they're going to know what happened. They may even take him to kill it. You know, a great question comes up here, and it's similar to what has been asked about Germans with the Holocaust. How could a nation of people think that if infanticide was appropriate? Where was the outcry against Pharaoh's injustice? Some people, they think that Pharaoh ruled Egypt with an iron fist and they oppressed the Egyptians just like he did the Israelites, but there's no evidence of that. In fact, the oppression of Israel was something that was created. They were not oppressed before Pharaoh realized that they were a threat. They were just like everyone else, living their life. How is it that people do this? That people can do this? We don't know the time frame here, but consider these things as precursors to this terrible situation. First of all, we see in chapter 1 verse 9, leadership chose a stance of fear. Now, to create this fear, the leaders used key words that would strike the hearts of the people. More and mightier. It's possible that the thought had already been growing in the minds of the Egyptians, and Pharaoh just capitalized on it. That's a possibility, and he used that to his advantage to gain power. The second idea here is that fear was expressed as a threat against them all. So That's chapter 1 and verse 10. If the Israelites continue to multiply, there'll be a threat. They'll turn against us. If we're ever attacked by someone, we'll have traitors living in our own midst. And then it's easy to say, well, we would have traitors in the future if we were attacked, to saying, hey, these people are probably our traitors. The third idea here is notice that the fear of something is not evidence it'll happen, but it became all the evidence that they needed. Fear is not evidence, but it became evidence because they heeded it. They listened to it. Fourth, this could not have happened without separation between Egypt and the Israelites. So in a sense, this all began when the Egyptians gave them the land of Goshen and chose them to look down on the shepherding as a profession. It was kind of inevitable from that point. But if you had the people mingling together and spending time together, and the Pharaoh said, hey, these people are a threat, they would have easily said, no, these people aren't a threat. We can trust these people because we know them. But they didn't really know them, and that was part of the problem. Fifth, fear was met with action, and that can be a really bad thing. Number 6, he appealed to the intellect. He said, let's deal shrewdly with them. You know, it's so amazing how arguments based on fear sound so convincing, even though when you look at them later, they're illogical. For example, did you ever grow up, when you were growing up, did you ever hear the rhyme that said, don't step on a crack, you'll break your mother's back? Things like this, silly little things that some people get caught up in. I remember that when I was a child, a big thing was Bloody Mary, saying Bloody Mary in a bathroom mirror in the dark by yourself 3 times, and Bloody Mary would show up in the mirror. And of course, that was things that are ridiculous, but they were kind of inducing fear, and there are all kinds of things that we've done. Those were kind of things that were done for play, but we know how fear works, and we know what it can cause us to believe. And even though I knew that, for example, the Bloody Mary thing, even though I knew that was fake and I knew it was ridiculous, I had a really hard time for a long time passing a mirror in the dark without my mind jumping to that and me being afraid. It's amazing. And so rational thought kind of goes out the window when we're afraid. And it's easy for us then to latch on to something that sounds rational and use it against our own selves. We really kind of shoot ourselves in the foot. So he appealed to their intellect. Let us deal shrewdly with them. And then we see that when those efforts to stop population growth of Israel failed, they just simply increased the pressure. They made life more difficult, through strenuous, unnecessary regulations, harsh penalties, that kind of thing. And when that failed, they turned to secretive missions to find ways to kill people, right? Abortion was common with the Egyptians from the way I understand it. Killing a baby at birth would not be a cause for alarm for the Egyptians. It happened all the time. And even though this was forced, the outcry wouldn't be brought up because their own practices then would be called into question. No one wants to do that. So it's easier just to ignore those kinds of things. It's more acceptable to kill the children than it would be to kill grown men, for example. So they just started there. And it was a secretive thing. And then it came to a point that the secret things weren't working, so Pharaoh called on his own people to kill babies. And by this time, the fear had already taken root. The enslavement of the people of Israel made the Israelites seem less than human, and so now it's easy for us to, if we're afraid of them and we already see them as less than human, it's no big deal to kill some of them, especially when it's babies and they're used to killing babies. Man, there's so much here that is parallel to what we're seeing in our country, in our culture, isn't it? We see anything in these verses that we can use to maybe understand the times? Maybe we can be forewarned of upcoming difficulties? Yeah, there's a lot here. First of all, fear can be used to manipulate people. And they can manipulate people into doing things they never would have done before. Secondly, continued fear-mongering. That's going to cause reaction of the masses. People can be afraid of something once, but it's the continuation of that fear. It's the continual effort of the fear-mongers. You're going to have reactions. Mixing fear with intellectual arguments can also be very powerful. It can change people's minds. The logic is not examined as closely. Fear motivates people to ignore facts that contradict. They develop kind of a just-in-case mentality. It becomes normal. Well, just in case, I know that the likelihood of these people being evil and harming us, it's really not that likely, but just in case, maybe we ought to see them differently. Maybe we ought to treat them differently, because who knows? We've been wrong before. Another idea here is oppression begins in small increments. It grows in small increments. It starts very small and it grows very large, and it can do it quickly, and sometimes it takes a while. Another thing is when fears mount against a subset of individuals in a society, against people who are easily distinguishable from the rest of the nation, that there's trouble. So if it's segregation, if it's separation based upon color of skin or things that are easily noticeable, it could be, like I said before, about dialect, your accent. It could be the clothes that you wear, the cars that you drive. I've seen in schools people being segregated by the kind of tennis shoe that they wore. There's all kinds of ways that we tend to separate people. But when the separation of the people is something that's easily distinguishable, see, I can easily see them, that's when trouble comes the most. And open and oppressive legislation, when we see that kind of thing, it shows that fears have already taken root, and the quiet efforts that they've employed have failed. There's always quiet efforts first. And when those fail, that's when open and oppressive legislation begins to show its head. And then things are bad and they're going to get worse. I hate to be a doomsayer, but that's the way it works. So what do we see? What can we do if we see things happening in our country or even our community? Well, here's some ideas that I came up with, and maybe you can add to that. If you have anything to add, please let me know. Jason@sparksmore.com, and you can get a hold of me there. Number one is remember that sometimes by reacting in fear, we make matters worse in the end. We don't want to react simply because of fear. Number two is we need to promote peace. Promoting peace, of course, is helping people who are fearful to recognize that there's probably not as much to be afraid of as they think there is. Number three is call into question the reasoning of fear-mongering. So, when you see the media out fear-mongering, they're just promoting fear, and it happens all the time. Ask questions, question their reasoning. Why is it that you think that this is so bad? Why is it that you think that the result of what's going on now is going to result in something that we don't like? Don't assume that their reasoning is correct simply because they're making an argument. Number four, get to know the people in question. The easiest way to overcome prejudice and fear is for people to know each other. If you're prejudiced against certain people, go meet those people and introduce yourself. Get yourself into their community, into their livelihood, and see that they're human beings just like you are. Number five, speak out about the quiet things. If you see quiet oppressions happening, what I mean by quiet is not that they're done, secretively. No one knows about it. But these are things that are not quote unquote official. These are things that tend to be done, but not necessarily are promoted as something that's going to be done. There are a lot of ways that could happen. If you see those kinds of things, say something. Speak out about it. Let other people know what's going on. Shed light on it. And then number six is get involved in your community. You don't have to run for office to influence your community. Just be a light. Help people see that fears are unfounded. And you can go a long way in helping someone overcome fears simply by helping people understand what their fears are and how unfounded those fears are. And what if we find ourselves in a situation like the children of Israel found themselves? Let's say that we see all these things happening and then we find ourselves in this oppressive situation like they found themselves in. Some people think that in America we're facing this right now. I don't know what the future holds, but I know we're not now where the Israelites were in chapter 2 of Exodus. But what happens if we get there? First of all, let's make sure we don't do the same things to them that they do to us. Secondly, build relationships where you can. Third, stand up for yourself. Turning the other cheek is not about it's not telling you to be a doormat. It means to stand up for yourself, but maintain respect for the people who hurt you. And that is something that we must do as Christians. Fourth is learn to accept some difficulties in hope of better days. We don't have to respond to every single little thing that happens against us. Number 5 is don't assume that everyone on the side of the oppressors actually believe the same way. It's likely that they're confused. They don't know how to change things themselves. And they're not the enemy. In fact, they can be strong allies. And number 6, speak up and tell others how you feel. Tell others what you see happening. It's going to take a lot of those kinds of things to help people realize what fear has caused them to do. But people can change. And the enemy of fear is truth. It's light. It's love. Interject that into other people's lives. Was there something I can do to help you in this area? If there's anything that you need from me, if you have questions or comments, please let me know. You can reach me at jason@sparksmore.com. Okay, moving then into Exodus chapter 2. In the middle of all this turmoil and oppression and fear-mongering going on in the book of Exodus chapter 1, in all of the infanticide that's going on, Moses was born. When it comes to God's people, there's always someone who will rise up. But it never happens when we think it should. It always seems like the situation is never going to improve, but it will. God always comes through in His time. And His time is the only time that matters. Listen to what Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 10 say. A man in the house of Levi went and took his wife, a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. When she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." Think about what's going on here. Look what happened. Can you see how this would be the ideal situation for a leader of Israel to grow up in the house of the Egyptians? And not just any Egyptian. This was Pharaoh's own household. There are definitely some ironies here that we will see. The advantage might not play out like we think it will. It will only play out the way God makes it play out. And that's, of course, what He's going to do. This is part of His plan. There are some ironies here. And there are some things that happen that you wouldn't expect to happen. But this is how things work with dealing with God. He does things His own way. And His own way is always the best way. Now, because of the love of Moses' mother, Moses was hidden so that he wouldn't be put to death. Now, that shows you how far this community has gone, doesn't it? The Israelites lived in isolation from the Egyptians. I've already said that before. The Egyptians would not want to be in their communities, the communities of the Israelites. Not only were the Israelite shepherds and revolting to them because they were, but they were also slaves now. But there would be people coming in and out of Egypt, out from Egypt into their land, especially the oppressive taskmasters. There would be some people coming in and out. And so there was danger. But could it also be possible that the oppression was so great that the people of Israel also began to kill their babies when they were born? It's not inconceivable. If people were afraid for their lives and they're having to choose between their own life or killing their child, a lot of people are going to choose to kill their children. I'm not saying that's right, but that's the way things tend to work. And so it's a possibility. It doesn't say that in the text. And We also found out that that never happened, I wouldn't be surprised about that either, because the people of Israel were strong, independent people. But you never know what's going to happen when people are pressed for a long period of time. Some people will do things. But Moses' mother, whose name, by the way, was Jochebed, she didn't have any respect or fear for the king's decrees, and she hid him. She hid him away. Now, at some point, the situation became worse, though, probably because, babies cry. People may have started asking questions. They realized she wasn't pregnant anymore. They said, hey, how's your baby? And she had to be kind of discreet and keep it to herself so no one could come and see the child. And she created then, because of that, a small container from bulrushes and pitch, and so that it would float. And then she stuck him out in the river. Did Jochebed know that he was going to be found? Did Jochebed know that Moses would be safe? Or did she just fear her own life and decide that she'd put the baby out to die on the Nile? I don't know. I don't think his sister knew either, because she stood afar off and watched to see what would happen to the baby boy. And Pharaoh's daughter just happened to see the small ark there floating, and so she found Moses. She had compassion on him because he was crying. And then the sister of Moses saw what was happening and asked if she could go find him a nurse. And she was allowed then to bring Moses' own mother to nurse him and help raise him. And she was even paid to do it. And she weaned Moses, and then she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her own. And she, the Pharaoh's daughter, is the one who named him Moses. That word Moses means drawn out. It's a perfect name for him, considering his future. He was being drawn out to become a great leader. Moses was not a leader of the children of Israel because he deemed himself worthy, or he decided for himself, I'm going to go lead these people out. It was pretty well forced upon him, but he was drawn out. It's a great way of calling it. But as great of a leader as he was, he didn't automatically become a leader. There are a lot of life lessons that he had to learn first, and that's another way that he was drawn out, right? It took a lot of time. In fact, when Moses came to ask for the people of Israel to be let go, he was 80 years old. He had a long life already. And this is how God operates. He raises up people not by simply calling them, but by preparing them. He created situations where they would be trusted and followed. He created situations where they would learn important lessons, and these great life lessons are what is preparing them and equipping them to do what he intended for them to do. And that's because God is the one who is in control. And we can see in Exodus chapter 2, verses 11-12, that Moses clearly understood his origins while he was growing up. We don't know all that he knew, but he understood something. And no doubt his mother spent time teaching him who he was so that he didn't become too influenced to turn against his own people, right? And this is part of the way God was raising him up. It says, now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian, and hid him in the sand. Now, I don't know how much Moses understood or knew about the Hebrew people, or even if he knew that much about his own history, but Hebrews chapter 11, verses 24-26 says this, by faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he looked to the reward. This says that Moses knew that God had promised Abraham that through his seed all the nations of the earth would be blessed. He may not have understood all that entailed. In fact, he probably couldn't have understood everything that entailed, but he believed in it. And of course, that promise refers to Jesus. So in a sense, Moses chose the afflictions of Jesus over the pleasures that were at his disposal, because he had his eyes on something bigger, the promises of God. But now he finds himself, he's in trouble because he's killed a man. And the next day he's out among the people again, and he stops a fight between two Hebrew men, and one of them mentioned the murder of the Egyptian guard. And if those two knew about it, then so did other people. And in fact, word got out, and Pharaoh decided to have Moses killed. So Moses fled for his life. Imagine this. This is the future leader of Israel, this great man of God. He started out on the run as a murderer. Do you think God can't use you if he wants to? You just got to be willing to obey him. When Moses fled, he went to Midian. He found a well there. He sat by it one day, resting, and he met the 7 daughters of a priest living in that area. That's chapter 2 and verse 16. That man's name was Reuel. Now, Moses helped these ladies get the water that they were looking for, and they returned home faster than normal. So Reuel asked, "How did you do it?" And they explained that they'd met an Egyptian who helped them. And Reuel called for Moses, and Moses stayed with him. Evidently, they hit it off, and they had a good relationship together. He also married one of Reuel's daughters, Zipporah. When he settled there, he began raising a family, forgetting about the oppression of Egypt. Well, it's possible that he thought there wasn't anything he could do about it anyway. I mean, if he showed his face, he might be put to death. But meanwhile, Pharaoh died, and the oppression of the people of Israel continued, and God began to act. What they saw was years of oppression with no end in sight, but they couldn't see the whole thing. God knew what he was doing, and he was preparing Moses, of all people, to go and confront Pharaoh, who incidentally, remember, was a part of the family that adopted Moses. So this was his, in a sense, his stepbrother, I guess, the adopted brother. Moses was adopted into Pharaoh's household, and that Pharaoh died. His son took over. I don't know how many children he had. I don't know if they even spent much time together, but you can imagine that they probably knew each other growing up. Now the scene is ready. The leaders are in place on the chessboard, and God is the one about to move Moses into position to show that God is the greatest and only God in the universe. But tough times are ahead for them all, and that's part of what we'll get into in the next podcast. Well, if you would like to discuss this, have any questions or comments, please get a hold of me, jason@sparksmore.com. I appreciate you listening to this and being a part of it. If you like this, please go give it a good rating, share it with other people. Maybe we can be a blessing to each other. Thank you so much for being a part of this, and I'll see you next time.